Deep in the quiet of the forest, a man's routine hike takes a heart-stopping turn when he hears faint whimpers coming from the shadows. Following the sound, he finds a tiny German Shepherd puppy, trembling and alone, its eyes wide with fear. But as he takes the pup into his care, he begins to notice peculiar traits that defy explanation. What Ethan thought was a simple act of kindness would soon lead to a discovery that would change everything. Stay tuned for a story of loyalty, survival, and the bond that defies nature itself. Ethan Miller had always found solace in nature. His hikes through the dense forests outside his small mountain town were his way of disconnecting from a world that often felt too noisy and overwhelming. The forest was his sanctuary, a place where he could breathe, think, and feel connected to something larger than himself. It was on one of these hikes, on a chilly autumn afternoon, that he heard it, a faint, pitiful whimper. Ethan froze mid-step, his senses sharpening. The sound was faint, almost drowned out by the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. But it was unmistakably the cry of a young animal. His heart quickened as he scanned the dense underbrush. "Hello," he called out, his voice cautious but warm. No response came. Only another soft whimper, this time closer. Ethan pushed through the undergrowth, his boots crunching on twigs and fallen leaves. After several tense moments, he spotted it. A tiny ball of fur huddled beneath a cluster of ferns. A puppy. Its small body was trembling, its fur dirty and matted. When Ethan crouched closer, the puppy flinched, its wide golden eyes filled with fear. "Hey there, little guy," Ethan said softly, extending a hand. The puppy did move but let out another small whimper, its ears flattening against its head. Ethan's heart ached at the sight. "You're okay now. I've got you." He gently scooped the puppy into his arms, noting how light it felt, far too underweight for its size. Its ribs were visible through its fur, and its paws were caked with mud. Yet, even in its weakened state, there was something striking about the pup. Its eyes, a piercing shade of amber, seemed almost too intense for a German Shepherd. Ethan dismissed the thought, chalking it up to the unique nature of rescue animals. As he carried the puppy back to the trail, Ethan couldn't shake a nagging thought. Where had it come from? There were no houses nearby, no signs of a litter or a mother. The isolation of the forest made its presence all the more puzzling. Back at his truck, Ethan wrapped the puppy in his jacket, his hands trembling slightly as he placed it on the passenger seat. "We'll get you cleaned up," he murmured, starting the engine. "You're safe now." The drive home was filled with quiet moments of reflection. Ethan glanced at the puppy occasionally, watching as it curled into the folds of his jacket. Despite his frailty, there was a quiet strength in its gaze, as though it were assessing him, deciding whether he was trustworthy. By the time Ethan arrived at his cabin, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the trees. He carried the puppy inside and immediately set about cleaning it up. The pup tolerated the bath without protest, though it shivered slightly as the warm water washed away the dirt and grime. Ethan noticed its sharp claws and slightly elongated snout, features that seemed more pronounced than those of a typical German Shepherd puppy. Again, he brushed the thought aside. After drying the puppy with a towel, Ethan prepared a small bowl of food. The pup devoured it eagerly, its tiny tail wagging for the first time. Ethan smiled. "You're a tough one," he said, scratching behind its ears. "I think I'll call you Shadow." Shadow looked up at him, its amber eyes gleaming in the soft light of the cabin. In that moment, Ethan felt an unspoken bond forming, a connection that would soon be tested in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Shadow's presence brought a new rhythm to Ethan's days. The once quiet cabin, tucked away at the edge of the forest, was now filled with the sounds of tiny paws skittering across wooden floors, and the occasional soft bark. Despite the pup's fragile state when Ethan first found him, Shadow recovered quickly, gaining weight and energy with each passing day. But as Shadow grew stronger, Ethan began to notice traits that set him apart from the other German Shepherds he had encountered. It started with subtle things, the way Shadow's ears twitched at the faintest of sounds, or the intensity with which he tracked movements in the forest outside. His amber eyes, so striking and vivid, seemed to take in every detail, watching Ethan with an intelligence that was almost unnerving. One morning, as Ethan sipped his coffee on the porch, Shadow sat beside him, his gaze fixed on the tree line. The pup's ears perked suddenly, and before Ethan could react, Shadow darted off into the woods. "Shadow!" Ethan called, nearly spilling his coffee as he jumped to his feet. He grabbed his jacket and ran after the pup, his heart pounding. Shadow's small form disappeared into the trees, moving with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for his size. Ethan pushed through the underbrush, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. "Shadow, come back!" he yelled, his voice echoing through the forest. He finally spotted the pup several yards ahead, standing still as a statue. Shadow's body was tense, his tail low but rigid. He was staring at something just beyond the clearing. Ethan approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the frosty ground. As he got closer, he saw what had caught Shadow's attention: a deer grazing in the distance. Shadow didn't move, his eyes locked on the animal. It wasn't the playful curiosity Ethan expected from a puppy. It was something far more primal. "Hey," Ethan said softly, kneeling beside Shadow. He placed a hand gently on the pup's back, feeling the rapid rise and fall of his tiny chest. "It's okay. Let's go home." Shadow didn't budge at first, but after a moment, he let out a low whine and turned to follow Ethan back to the cabin. As they walked, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about his new companion, something he couldn't quite put into words. That evening, Ethan decided to do some research. Sitting at his kitchen table with Shadow curled up at his feet, he browsed through articles and forums about German Shepherds. He learned about their traits, their behaviors, and their history as working dogs. But none of it explained Shadow's unusual instincts. Frustrated, Ethan closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. "Maybe I'm overthinking this," he muttered, looking down at Shadow. The pup stirred, stretching lazily before climbing into Ethan's lap. Ethan smiled, stroking the soft fur behind Shadow's ears. "You're just a special little guy, aren't you?" The next few weeks brought more questions than answers. Shadow's growth was rapid, far exceeding what Ethan had expected. His legs grew longer, his paws larger, and his body took on a lean, muscular build. But it wasn't just his physical changes that stood out. His behavior became increasingly peculiar. One night, Ethan woke to the sound of low growling. He grabbed a flashlight and crept out of bed, finding Shadow standing by the back door. The pup's hackles were raised, and his growl deepened as he stared into the darkness beyond the glass. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered, turning on the flashlight and shining it outside. The beam of light illuminated the edge of the forest, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, Shadow remained tense, his gaze fixed on something Ethan couldn't see. After several minutes, Shadow finally relaxed. Though he remained by the door for the rest of the night, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if Shadow was sensing something beyond his comprehension, something wild and untamed. Despite his growing concerns, Ethan's bond with Shadow deepened. The pup followed him everywhere, from chopping wood in the backyard to long hikes through the forest. Shadow's loyalty was unwavering, and Ethan found comfort in his companionship. But the nagging question remained: what made Shadow so different? The answer, Ethan would soon discover, lay not in the traits of a German Shepherd, but in something far more unexpected. A truth that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the animal he had come to love. Ethan's curiosity about Shadow's behavior grew with each passing day. The pup's rapid growth was undeniable, his legs now long and powerful, his body sleek yet muscular. But what stood out most were his instincts. Shadow seemed to possess an uncanny ability to sense things long before Ethan could see or hear them. Whether it was wildlife in the forest or a distant storm rolling in, Shadow always knew first. One afternoon, while hiking along a familiar trail, Ethan encountered an older man walking his dog, a stocky Labrador retriever named Max. As their paths crossed, Max barked excitedly, tugging at his leash to greet Shadow. Shadow, however, didn't respond with the playful energy Ethan had come to expect from puppies. Instead, he stood still, his posture calm but deliberate, as if assessing the Labrador. "Beautiful dog you've got there," the man said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Shadow. "But he doesn't look like a pure shepherd." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" The man gestured toward Shadow, who was now sitting at Ethan's side, his piercing amber eyes fixed on the Labrador. It's the build. And those eyes. Those aren't typical for a German Shepherd. You might have a mix on your hands. Ethan laughed nervously. Yeah, maybe. He's a rescue, so I don't know much about his background. The man nodded, but didn't press further. As they parted ways, Ethan couldn't shake the man's words. Shadow wasn't a pure shepherd. Deep down, Ethan had suspected as much. But hearing it aloud made him wonder, what exactly was Shadow's lineage? Later that evening, Ethan decided to dig deeper. He sat at his desk with Shadow lying at his feet, the glow of his computer screen casting soft light across the room. He began researching traits and physical characteristics of German Shepherd mixes, scrolling through endless photos and articles. After hours of searching, he stumbled upon a forum dedicated to wolf-dog hybrids. His heart skipped a beat as he clicked on a thread titled, "How to Identify a Wolf Hybrid." The images in the post were striking. Many of the dogs featured had the same intense amber eyes as Shadow, along with elongated snouts, larger paws, and an almost regal posture. Ethan glanced down at Shadow, who was now watching him intently, as if sensing the weight of his discovery. No, Ethan muttered to himself, shaking his head. You can't be. But the more he read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The heightened senses, the cautious demeanor, the rapid growth, all were traits commonly associated with wolf hybrids. Ethan's mind raced. If Shadow was part wolf, what did that mean for their future? Could he still care for him? Would Shadow's instincts pose a danger to others? The following morning, Ethan decided to seek professional advice. He loaded Shadow into his truck and drove to a wildlife sanctuary on the outskirts of town. The sanctuary specialized in caring for wolf-dog hybrids, and Ethan hoped they could provide answers. Upon arriving, he was greeted by a woman named Laura, a wildlife expert with years of experience working with wolves. She crouched to examine Shadow, her eyes widening slightly as she ran her hands gently over his frame. He's stunning, she said, her voice laced with admiration. But he's definitely not a pure German Shepherd. There's wolf in him. I'd say about 30%, maybe 40%. Ethan felt a mix of emotions, relief at finally having answers, but also a deep sense of uncertainty. What does that mean for him? For me? Laura smiled reassuringly. It means he's unique. Wolf hybrids can be amazing companions, but they require understanding and patience. Their instincts are stronger, their loyalty unmatched, but they're also more independent. It's a balance. Ethan nodded, his mind racing with questions. Can I still keep him? That depends on you, Laura replied. He's bonded with you, and that's a powerful thing. As long as you respect his nature and give him the space and structure he needs, there's no reason you can't give him a good life. On the drive home, Ethan glanced at Shadow, who was curled up on the passenger seat, his ears twitching slightly with every sound outside. The revelation of Shadow's heritage didn't change how Ethan felt about him. It only deepened his admiration for the pup's resilience and uniqueness. You're one of a kind, Shadow, Ethan said softly, reaching over to scratch behind his ears. Shadow let out a contented sigh, his amber eyes meeting Ethan's briefly before closing in relaxation. Though the path ahead would be filled with challenges, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He and Shadow were in this together, no matter what. Ethan awoke the next morning with a sense of renewed determination. The revelation about Shadow's lineage had left him with more questions than answers, but it also deepened his resolve to provide the best possible life for the hybrid pup. He spent the early hours preparing the cabin for Shadow's growing needs, reinforcing the backyard fence and setting up a larger enclosure where Shadow could safely explore and play. Shadow, as always, was by Ethan's side, his sharp amber eyes following every movement. Despite the quiet routine of the morning, there was an undercurrent of unease in the pup's behavior. He paced more than usual, his ears constantly swiveling toward the forest. Something had caught his attention, though Ethan couldn't see or hear anything unusual. By the time they set out for their daily walk, Shadow's energy was electric. He pulled at the leash, his nose low to the ground as he sniffed the trail with heightened focus. Ethan tightened his grip, trying to match Shadow's pace. What's gotten into you, boy? He asked, though Shadow's attention remained fixed on the path ahead. The forest was alive with the sounds of spring, birds chirping in the treetops, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. But as they ventured deeper, Ethan noticed a change. The usual tranquility of the woods gave way to an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the dirt trail. Shadow froze suddenly, his body stiff and his ears pricked forward. Ethan stopped too, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. "What is it?" he whispered, lowering his voice instinctively. Before he could react, Shadow let out a low growl and lunged forward, nearly pulling the leash from Ethan's hands. A flash of movement caught Ethan's eye, a figure darting through the underbrush. Too quick to identify, Shadow barked, his tone deeper and more menacing than Ethan had ever heard. "Shadow, no!" Ethan called, struggling to regain control. The pup strained against the leash, his muscles taut and his gaze fixed on the fleeing figure. Ethan's heart raced as he finally managed to pull Shadow back, crouching to meet his eyes. "Calm down. It's okay," he said firmly, placing a steady hand on Shadow's chest. Shadow's growling subsided, but his body remained tense. Ethan knelt there for a moment, his own breathing unsteady as he tried to process what had just happened. Whatever they had seen, it wasn't a deer or another small animal. The movement was deliberate, almost calculated, like something watching them. Back at the cabin, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Shadow paced near the window, his ears twitching at every sound outside. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at his laptop as he tried to piece together the events of the day. He searched for information about wildlife in the area, wondering if they had encountered a wolf pack or a lone predator. The idea of Shadow's instincts being tied to his wolf ancestry gnawed at Ethan. While his loyalty and intelligence were remarkable, his growing wildness presented challenges Ethan hadn't anticipated. He needed guidance, someone who understood hybrids and their unique needs. He remembered Laura's words from the sanctuary. Their instincts are stronger, but so is their bond with the people they trust. Shadow had trusted Ethan since the day they met, and Ethan wasn't about to break that trust now. The next day, Ethan decided to take Shadow to the meadow near the river, a place that had always been peaceful. He hoped the open space and fresh air would help Shadow relax. As they arrived, Shadow's demeanor shifted. He sniffed the ground eagerly, his tail wagging slightly as he trotted ahead. For a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to believe that everything was fine. Shadow played with a stick, tossing it into the air and pouncing after it with the awkward grace of a young pup. Ethan laughed, his worries melting away as he watched the scene. But the peace was short-lived. Shadow suddenly stopped, his body stiffening as he stared toward the tree line. Ethan followed his gaze, his smile fading. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at them from the shadows, low to the ground and unblinking. Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized what they were looking at. A wolf. It was larger than he had expected, its thick gray coat blending seamlessly with the forest. Shadow didn't bark or growl this time. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his ears forward and his tail low. The wolf didn't move, its gaze shifting between Ethan and Shadow. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Ethan slowly reached for Shadow's leash, his movements deliberate. "Easy, Shadow," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The wolf eventually turned and disappeared into the woods, its departure as silent as its arrival. Shadow let out a small whine, his body relaxing slightly as the tension lifted. Ethan knelt beside him, running a hand through his thick fur. "That was close," he muttered, his voice shaking. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Shadow's wolf heritage wasn't just a part of him. It was a connection to a world Ethan barely understood. And that world was closer than he had realized. Ethan spent the following days reflecting on the encounter with the wolf. It wasn't just the suddenness of the moment that unsettled him. It was Shadow's reaction. The pup hadn't barked or shown aggression. Instead, his stance mirrored that of the wolf, calculated, alert, and restrained. Shadow hadn't feared the wolf. If anything, it felt as though they had recognized each other. Sitting on the porch one evening, Ethan watched Shadow lying at the edge of the yard. The pup's gaze was fixed on the forest, his body still but not tense. Ethan couldn't help but wonder what Shadow was thinking. Did he sense the wolf nearby? Was he longing for a connection to the part of him that Ethan could never fully understand? "Who are you really?" Ethan muttered, leaning back in his chair. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but he didn't move. For the first time since their bond had formed, Ethan felt a flicker of doubt. Could he truly care for an animal whose instincts were so deeply tied to the wild? The next morning, Ethan decided to revisit the wildlife sanctuary. Laura had been honest and knowledgeable, and he hoped she could provide more guidance. Shadow sat calmly in the truck during the drive, his amber eyes scanning the passing scenery. Ethan couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He wanted answers, but part of him feared what he might learn. When they arrived, Laura greeted them warmly. She crouched to examine Shadow, who sniffed her hands before wagging his tail. "He looks amazing," she said, scratching behind his ears. "You've taken great care of him." "Thanks," Ethan replied, his tone hesitant. "But there's more going on than I expected." Laura raised an eyebrow, motioning for Ethan to follow her to a shaded picnic table. Shadow trotted behind them, his posture relaxed yet alert. Once seated, Ethan recounted the encounter with the wolf and Shadow's reaction. Laura listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying nothing until he finished. "It makes sense," she said finally. "Wolf hybrids often have an instinctive connection to their wild counterparts. It's not unusual for them to recognize each other in ways we don't fully understand." Ethan leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "But what does that mean for him, for us? Am I putting him, or others, in danger?" Laura's expression softened. "It doesn't mean he's dangerous, Ethan. It means he's unique. Hybrids are a balance of two worlds, domesticated and wild. The key is understanding his triggers and working with his instincts instead of against them." "But what if those instincts lead him back to the wild?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with worry. Laura hesitated, her gaze shifting to Shadow, who was sniffing a patch of grass nearby. "That's a possibility," she admitted. "But you've built a bond with him, and that bond is stronger than you realize. If you nurture it, it will guide him just as much as his instincts do." On the drive home, Laura's words echoed in Ethan's mind. He glanced at Shadow, who was curled up in the passenger seat, his breathing steady. Ethan couldn't deny the bond they shared, but he also couldn't ignore the pull of the wild that seemed to linger in Shadow's every action. That night, Ethan decided to test their bond in a new way. He took Shadow to the clearing near the river, the same place where they had encountered the wolf. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the landscape. Shadow moved confidently, his nose to the ground as he explored. Ethan watched from a distance, his heart heavy with uncertainty. Shadow stopped suddenly, his body stiffening as he stared toward the tree line. For a brief moment, Ethan felt a pang of fear. Was the wolf back? Was Shadow about to disappear into the woods? But instead of running, Shadow turned back toward Ethan. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Ethan felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. Shadow trotted back to his side, his tail wagging softly. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" Ethan said, kneeling to scratch behind Shadow's ears. The pup licked his hand, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. Ethan smiled, his chest tight with relief. "We'll figure this out together." As they walked back to the cabin, Ethan realized that Shadow wasn't defined by his wild instincts or his domesticated upbringing. He was a bridge between two worlds, and it was Ethan's job to honor both sides of him. For the first time, Ethan felt confident that they could navigate the challenges ahead together. The days following their visit to the clearing were a delicate balance between routine and uncertainty. Ethan worked hard to provide Shadow with the structure and care he needed, but he couldn't ignore the moments when the pup's gaze would drift toward the forest, his body taut with longing. Shadow was loyal, but his instincts were undeniable. Part of him still belonged to the wild. One crisp morning, Ethan woke to find Shadow sitting by the cabin window, his ears perked and his body still. Outside, the forest was bathed in golden light, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Shadow didn't bark or whine. He simply stared, as though waiting for something, or someone. Ethan approached quietly, placing a hand on Shadow's back. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. Shadow's ears twitched, but he didn't break his gaze. For a moment, Ethan wondered if the wolf was back, watching them from the shadows. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Later that day, Ethan decided to take Shadow to the river clearing again. hoping the familiar surroundings would help ease the tension he felt brewing in the pup. As they walked, Ethan noticed how Shadow moved with purpose. His nose low to the ground, and his steps deliberate. It wasn't the playful energy of a puppy. It was the calculated precision of a predator. When they reached the clearing, Shadow froze, his body rigid as he scanned the tree line. Ethan followed his gaze but saw nothing. "It's okay," he said softly, kneeling beside Shadow. "There's nothing here." But Shadow's posture didn't relax. He let out a low, guttural growl, his eyes fixed on a specific spot in the woods. Ethan's heart pounded as he strained to see what Shadow had detected. After a tense moment, a figure emerged from the shadows. A lone wolf. The wolf was massive, its gray coat thick, and its amber eyes sharp. It stepped into the clearing with a calm, deliberate stride, its gaze locked on Shadow. Ethan's first instinct was fear. He gripped Shadow's leash tightly, ready to pull him back, but Shadow didn't move. Instead, he stood his ground, his body language neither submissive nor aggressive. The two animals stared at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and as he watched the exchange, it was as though Shadow and the wolf were communicating in a language only they could understand. After what felt like an eternity, the wolf turned and disappeared into the woods, its departure as silent as its arrival. Shadow let out a small whine, his body relaxing as the tension lifted. Ethan knelt beside him, running a hand through his fur. "You knew," he said quietly. "You knew it was out there." The encounter left Ethan with more questions than answers. Shadow's connection to the wolf was undeniable, but what did it mean for their future? Was the wolf a threat, or was it something else entirely? A link to Shadow's past. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Ethan couldn't shake the image of the wolf. He glanced at Shadow, who was curled up at his feet, his breathing steady and his body relaxed. The pup seemed at peace, but Ethan knew the wild still called to him. It wasn't something he could train out of Shadow or suppress. It was part of who he was. Ethan leaned down, resting a hand on Shadow's back. "I don't know what the future holds," he said softly, "but I know I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Shadow stirred, lifting his head to look at Ethan. His amber eyes were calm, but there was an intensity in them that Ethan couldn't ignore. It was the look of an animal that straddled two worlds, a creature bound by loyalty but driven by instinct. As the fire crackled and the cabin grew quiet, Ethan made a decision. He would honor both sides of Shadow, the loyal companion who had become his family, and the wild spirit that would always be a part of him. It wouldn't be easy, but their bond was worth it. Together, they would navigate the challenges ahead, one step at a time. Spring had fully arrived, and with it came a sense of renewal. The forest surrounding Ethan's cabin buzzed with life. Birds nesting in the treetops, deer grazing in the meadows, and the gentle hum of a nearby stream flowing freely after the thaw. For Ethan and Shadow, life had found a new rhythm, one that balanced the pup's wild instincts with their deepening bond. Shadow had grown into a striking figure. His coat, sleek and glossy, shone under the sunlight as he trotted through the clearing near the river. His once clumsy puppy movements had given way to a confident, almost regal stride. But it was his eyes, those piercing amber eyes, that continued to captivate Ethan. They seemed to hold the wisdom of both worlds, bridging the gap between domestication and the untamed wild. Ethan had made peace with Shadow's dual nature. After weeks of research, conversations with Laura, and countless hours observing Shadow, Ethan understood what the hybrid pup needed: freedom, structure, and trust. Shadow wasn't just a pet. He was a partner, a creature with instincts that demanded respect, and a bond that required mutual understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and Shadow sat on the porch, the warm glow of the day fading into twilight. Shadow lay at Ethan's feet, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Ethan sipped his coffee, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. "It's funny," Ethan said aloud, glancing down at Shadow. "When I found you, I thought I was saving you, but I think you've saved me just as much." Shadow lifted his head, his gaze meeting Ethan's. It was a moment of unspoken connection, the kind that transcended words. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, a wave of gratitude washing over him. Their peace was interrupted by a sound that Ethan had come to recognize. The distant howl of a wolf. It was faint, barely audible over the rustling leaves. But Shadow's ears perked immediately. He stood, his body alert as he stared toward the forest. Ethan's heart sank slightly. He knew this moment would come. The pull of the wild was a part of Shadow, and it couldn't be ignored. "It's okay, boy," Ethan said softly, standing to kneel beside him. "You're free to go if you need to." But Shadow didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the tree line, his body tense with indecision. After a long pause, he let out a small whine and turned back to Ethan, pressing his head against his chest. Ethan felt a mix of relief and heartache. Shadow had chosen to stay, at least for now, but the wild would always call to him. "You're one of a kind, Shadow," Ethan whispered, stroking his fur, "and I'm lucky to have you." As the weeks turned into months, Ethan and Shadow continued to thrive. Shadow's instincts never wavered, but Ethan had learned to work with them rather than against them. He built a larger enclosure near the cabin, allowing Shadow the space to roam freely while keeping him safe. Their walks in the forest became a daily ritual, a time for both of them to connect with nature and each other. One afternoon, as they wandered through the meadow, Ethan spotted something unusual near the riverbank. The same wolf they had encountered before. It stood at a distance, its body relaxed, but its gaze watchful. Shadow froze, his ears perking as he locked eyes with the wolf. Ethan held his breath, unsure of what would happen, but instead of approaching, the wolf let out a soft huff and turned, disappearing into the forest. Shadow let out a small bark, his tail wagging slightly as he watched the wolf leave. Ethan smiled, placing a hand on Shadow's back. "I think they know you're happy here," he said softly. That evening, back at the cabin, Ethan sat by the fire with Shadow curled up beside him. The glow of the flames danced across the walls, casting a warm, golden light. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a sense of contentment settling over him. "You're not just a dog," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're family." Shadow stirred, lifting his head to nuzzle against Ethan's hand. In that moment, Ethan knew that their journey wasn't just about survival. It was about trust, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond they had formed. The wild would always be a part of Shadow, but so would Ethan, and together they had found something rare and beautiful, a place where both worlds could coexist. Shadow and Ethan's journey reminds us of the power of trust and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with others who love heartfelt stories. Together, let's celebrate the beauty of resilience and connection.